Good evening, and welcome to Naples United Church of Christ and our Clergy Roundtable as we continue our journey through the wonderful book, Deep Rooted in Christ, The Way of Transformation by Joshua Chunmin Kane. Tonight is is this week 4, week 3? I can't keep up.
They all go together.
Exactly. I know. That's my thing.
Wild.
Here's what I do know. It's part 6. And I know that because it's in my notes right in front of me. And it is entitled Ways to Fruitfulness. And if you were following along, reading along, or following along with us tonight, that will be pages 117 to 126. So not a lot of necessarily material page-wise or chapter-wise necessarily, but I believe we'll get into some juicy stuff. So I'm looking forward to that. And as always, I'm thrilled to have colleagues who I also consider dear friends with me this evening, and Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris-Ewing, our assistant minister, and of course, Reverend Dr. Who are you? Deb Kaiser-Cross, who is our minister for congregational care. And let's see, it's March 17th. And so, do you have the clock?
I do not, off
Okay.
the top of my head. I just know it's the end of May sometime.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've been in your office. I haven't seen anything different. So, although I did see you throw out a piece of furniture, but that was an old chair that needed to go.
Yeah, one that you donated.
I was going to say, because
here.
it came with me from Dallas, so I
Yeah.
know that it's old. So, yeah. Well, as we get started, as we do each week, I really want to thank Alex from our production team, who is with us this evening, and the amount of things that they have to coordinate is really remarkable. So thank you to Alex, and thank you to Wendy for making all of this come together, and we are grateful always to her. What announcements do we want to make? Obviously, we have worship on Sunday, and I believe you're preaching, Sharon.
I am.
Is that correct? And then next week we have our Lenten meditation, and our colleague, Reverend Catherine Mulhern, is preaching. And Catherine, I believe, is a gifted preacher and just a trusted colleague and friend.
She is.
And so it'll be great. So we want to invite and welcome people back next Wednesday via stream and Facebook Live and YouTube to both worship and, of course, Clergy Roundtable as we continue. Who has the lead next week? I can't remember.
I think it's me.
I think it's you, Deb.
1 week
I
at a
think I'm
time.
the last one.
I know, that's,
Haven't done
trust
it
me.
yet.
No. I mean, it is 1 week at a time.
Yeah.
Again, so we're grateful to have you with us, my friends. I'm grateful to have you alongside me. And why don't we just dive right in? Again, these chapters are very quick. They're really, about 2 pages each. But we dive in with chapter 33, which is entitled, What is God Looking For? And there are 2 scriptural references that I think are crucial to really setting not only the foundation for this chapter, but I believe setting the foundation for the conversation that we'll have this evening. The first coming from John 15, my parent is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. Obviously, Jesus' words there. And then again from John 15, but later in the chapter, you did not choose me, but I chose you. And I appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last, so that God will give you whatever you ask him in my name. So, of course, as I mentioned, this part is entitled Ways to Fruitfulness. What's your favorite fruit? Since we're going to talk about fruitfulness all night.
Favorite fruit.
What do you like? Because that's really what we talk about all evening. So we might as well get in the mindset.
I love so much fruit. I eat so much fruit, but probably at the top of the list would be blueberries.
Oh.
And I love the taste of blueberries, but not the texture.
Texture, yeah.
So I am a raspberry, strawberry fan, but berries for sure.
Yeah. I like both of those. I love pineapple.
Ooh.
I think there's nothing better than really juicy, sweet pineapple. But
They're all just
We could go. We could make a long list.
I was going to say, now I'm kind of hungry, so we should probably get through this. But I don't know. I was thinking about that as I was finishing our questions. I thought I should just have asked everyone what their favorite fruit is, because we talk about that. So Cain plays with these images in this first chapter, and he talks about this idea of fruit, which produces seeds, which can do all this good, which obviously I don't have issue with. Where he sometimes loses me is he puts this up against the image of flowers, which provide beauty. And obviously, clearly we have them every week, both in our worship space, and then we bring them in here and things. And so Cain talks about the fact that God is asking us to be fruit and to bear fruit and to be fruitful, and not to be simply flowers that just decorate and wither away. My words, but it's kind of summarizing that. And so on page 117, he says, I know that flowers have a lovely fragrance, but fruit offers something much more precious than flowers. It produces seed, which brings life and looks to the future. And so I was thinking about this as people, which again, Cain is going toward. I'm just wondering, have you ever worked with someone that you felt was more of a flower person than a fruit person? Or I think you could put this in a much broader context. Do you have someone in your family? Do you have someone, in your life that you feel like, to me, it's kind of a substance type reference?
Before I answer that question, I want to take issue with his contrast.
All right.
Because I thought to myself, that's a really limited image of flowers. So I literally went to the internet and looked up function of flowers. And flowers, the function includes pollination, seed production, and fruit production. And one place talked about fruits are seed coverings. And it seems to me that flowers do a lot that is good besides look pretty. So I don't like the metaphor that he's using, but if I take it to, if I use a word like flashy, or in other places he talks a lot about outward appearance. So if you want to talk about people who seem not to be substantive, but to be just flashy and wanting to look good without the substance, then I could talk about it. But I don't like fruits and flower contrast.
I'm curious, did you have a similar reaction?
I didn't, but that's the nature of it. I really just took it as a general metaphor for what you said in the very last part, which is it flashiness or substance in people? And because I do think metaphors are always they're both expansive and limiting, if you really think about it.
Right.
And so I just kind of gave him the benefit of the doubt. But I didn't really want to think about it in terms of other people, but I did want to think about it for me.
Sure.
And for me, when I would prefer to be a flower, metaphorically speaking, I'd like to impress. I like to please other people. I like to do all this outward stuff to be accepted or acceptable. And when I'm willing to be seed, I'm willing to be hidden. I'm willing to be broken apart, and I'm willing to be in a place where new life can emerge, even if I don't understand it. So that's the way I've kind of did the contrast on that one. It's easier to be a flower than it is to be a seed for me, because the seed requires self-sacrifice, and the flower gets a lot of affirmation.
Yeah, and I was also thinking, as you were responding, Deb, I was also thinking about the fact that something that you and I share is that we're both Enneagram 3s. And one of the things that Ian Cron, who does a lot of writing about Enneagram, and I think is one of the, if not the leading expert on Enneagrams today, talks about is that threes, one of the things that can be both shadow side, but also in our positive side as well, is that we like things to look nice. I mean, that can be something that, again, is appealing, but can also be to a detriment as well. And you're
Yes.
much more educated about that.
When we're focused on external appearance, I
Mhm.
think that's what he's trying to get at.
Right.
I mean, I think that's been kind of a theme throughout the book. I do think his metaphors can be limiting, but again, I wonder if some of it's language.
So I was
Yeah.
actually going to ask the same thing. If you wondered that too about the language, because I think you raised that one of the weeks that you were leading about if there was a translation issue in the sense of, I don't think it's cultural. I just wonder if there was translation.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
I just want to give him the benefit of the doubt because I do think that if you take it down the road, I think he intended it.
Mhm.
There's some truth and merit to it. I think, one of the things, you're both and person. You hate either or. I mean, that's
do.
one of the things we've learned about each other. And so he sets up a lot of
Mhm.
those situations
Mm.
where you're either this or that, when in fact, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And I think that's where the discussion comes in.
Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful.
Well, and I thought of, I didn't personalize it as you did, Deb, which is very helpful. But I did think about, and I hate to generalize so much, but it's my stereotype, and I own it with the bias that it includes, that the pastors, preachers who I put into that sort of flashy category tend to be like the televangelists
Mhm.
and the people who are all about give me money and you'll be prosperous. And so that's kind of my stereotype. When I thought about pastors I've known, not many of them would count as flashy. I mean, and they're not in settings where that's what it's about. They're trying to do the best in a hard time, and that's before the pandemic.
Yeah.
That just being a pastor is hard. I think perhaps that temptation to fall into appearance and looking good is more of a temptation for large churches with resources
Mhm.
because we have the means to pay more attention to that than a church that um, doesn't have those means. And so I think it's challenging to us as pastors or people in this church to think about making sure that there's always the substance along with whatever appearances there are. Last thing I'll say about this that is another nuance for me, and I didn't even realize until we were talking how I had sort of changed it. But in addition to being seed, one of the ways that I think about what we do is planting seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reminded that in the book of prayers that I wrote many years ago, I talked about teachers planting seeds and nurturing soil and watering and care, but God gives the growth. And I think the same is true for parents. We plant the seeds that we hope will grow in our children, and I think it's the same for pastors that what we give and put out there for people as a seed, then we hope that God will help it to grow in their lives and in the life of the church. But that's different than being the seed, and so I was elaborating on his image.
I'm going to go back to kind of like there are certain pastors who are flashy, and it's part of sometimes they're charismatic. It's just who they are because they tend to be flashy people. And I also don't want to minimize that as a gift is when there's no substance, that's a problem. But because I have been around what I would describe as flashy pastors, but it's genuine. If there's no substance there, I would be more concerned. But I've seen substance. It's just some people just are like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's authenticity behind it,
Yeah, yeah.
because again, as we've talked about, I think one of the major challenges of facing religion and church today, church universal, is that I think a far greater threat to the future of the church is inauthenticity in pastors rather than flashiness. I mean, as we often say around here, be who you are, but be real, And so I think,
And use your gifts. And
right, yeah,
if some of your gifts look a little flashy, it's like Paul and when he's talking about the gifts in First Corinthians, some are going to be flashy
right,
and some are not. It does not mean any of the gifts are greater or less than the others.
right.
So
Two things that really stand out as I reflect and hear your responses. One is, Deb, you really raised up something that King says that struck me when I was reading it and rereading it for today, but also that you said is that to be a true seed, again using this metaphor, you really have to be buried. You are hidden, and I think that's an image that I'll speak for myself. Sometimes can make me uncomfortable. I think for a variety of ways. But I do think about that as part of that image, that he raises. But I think it's an important one. I don't think I'm not uncomfortable with it because it's not good. It's just it challenges me.
it means the ego gets hidden.
Yeah, I think it's
I don't like it.
right. No, I think
either.
I think it's both the ego and
Yeah.
also like when I think about being buried and hidden, I think about that's hard work. And that's really, not to overplay the metaphor, but that's when it gets dirty, and I mean it's really that stuff. And then,
Well, just keep going because that's the lectionary text for the 21st. So
yeah, so we'll just
I'll take all of your
Thanks
ideas.
for helping you.
don't mind Sharon while she takes copious notes here. And then I also wanted to raise this is somewhat of a side note, but I think I just want to remind our congregation and those who watch is that I just, as a colleague but also as a friend, I just want to reiterate how proud I am that to have two colleagues who have written books. You were talking about the prayer book that you've written, but you've written other books. I have
No, just
the one. You've written multiple books.
Just to.
Just two. But I have copies of both of them in my collection and actually at home because I like to have copies of books that friends have written in my home. But I just think it's so cool that both of you, and then Deb, I didn't share with you, but recently I was having dinner with a church member who said that every morning they begin with reading a chapter from your book each morning, and then going the distance. And I just thought that was a cool way. And I hated that they didn't have any other devotional resource. No, I'm just kidding. And so King, I appreciate that conversation. King continues on page 118 and says, as much as God loves the flower of trees, God isn't interested in flashy bouquets or fancy floral displays. What God values is the inner beauty, the beauty of the heart. And one of my favorite books, plays, and now was a smash Broadway musical is The Color Purple. And I have immense respect for the author of the book, Alice Walker. I think she brings great richness to our society and through her writing. She has this quote from The Color Purple, and I apologize in advance if the language offends, but she writes, I think it pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it. People think pleasing God is all God cares about, but any fool living in the world can see it's always trying to please us back. And so I was just thinking about these two gifted authors who offer us these, in some ways, paradoxical understandings of God, but also these paradoxical understandings of perhaps how we view God and how we please God. And I just want to open that to a rich conversation because I was intrigued by that because, again, that color purple quote is just something that's always near me because I like it so much. And so I was just wondering if you had thoughts about that you might be willing to share.
Sure. For me, the juxtaposition isn't problematic at all.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, again, he's back in that flashy
Hmm.
focus. And if I need, I'm just going to speak for me, if I need to be at the center of things,
Hmm.
to be flashy and to be appreciated and to be valued, that's problematic spiritually for me.
Okay. For you.
For me,
No, yeah, I'm just,
if I need to be.
right.
If I appreciate that, if people are complimentary or people are grateful that I had done something,
Hmm.
that's fine. But if the need is driving me to be flashy, that's my
Okay,
problem,
I get it.
ego wise and spiritually.
Right.
However, part of the spiritual life for me, it begins with gratitude.
Hmm.
And so I am unbelievably grateful for everything God has created. And that's the starting point of my spirituality. So for me, one of them is just gratitude as a spiritual practice, but the other is not needing to be the center of things, also as a spiritual practice.
No, I really appreciate that. What were your
Well,
thoughts on that?
Deb already said I'm a both and person. So I look at these and I don't I don't see a conflict because I don't think of creation, the flower of trees, or anything about creation as um, superficial or flashy. And I think about the beauty of creation is not only in what we see with our eyes, but you think about what scientists see with microscopes,
Mm.
and you think about what astronomers see with telescopes. I mean, there's there's nothing that's just surface level about creation itself. It is complex and beautiful and deep. And I think about the mathematicians who love the patterns they find in things. So I just don't see creation as anything other than deep and beautiful in complex ways. So um, that's part of God loving us back. I mean, for me, they go together.
I was just thinking, and I love the image that you speak of, Sharon, about the depth of creation. I was just thinking about how, NASA just put it's not the rover, right? But it's a different
Mhm.
vehicle on Mars. And one of the, as I understand it, very limited understanding, one of the things that they're really after is that this particular vehicle can dig into the planet because they are looking for evidence of water molecules and fossil molecules or fossil images of fossils to understand what life has appeared and been like on Mars. To see, basically, to answer, I was listening to a podcast about this last week, but it was to answer the question, are we alone, basically, as humans, in the solar system? And I just was thinking about, as you were answering that, thinking about how we as humans continuously are trying to look below the surface because creation, I think, calls us to that level. So I love that image that you offer. And I was thinking back to Deb, as you were speaking, I was thinking about, you remember, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, or actually probably longer than that, but every time our worship team gathers, we start with a question. And if you remember, recently we were talking about affirmation. How do you feel affirmed? And one of the ways that I show affirmation, a love language, if you will, but also a way that I receive affirmation, is I like to send people flowers. And I like to receive flowers. I think that's just, and part of it is because the surprise of it is always wonderful and things, but the beauty of fresh cut flowers. I think it beautifies a home, an office, a worship space, and so I do think, you know, I would not want to take King's metaphor too far because I think it does take away from the beauty. And I think that's in some ways what I love about Alice Walker's quote about the color purple, because I do think God puts, I mean, it's one of the things I love about living in Southwest Florida is we are just so surrounded by beauty.
And I think that God, for most people, God gets our attention through nature.
Yeah.
And so, even as little ones, just the amazing beauty around us, that's how we first hear God's voice, I think.
Mhm.
Before anyone ever says anything, we are awed and realize that there's something bigger than me in this world.
Yeah.
And I think God constantly uses creation to woo us
Mhm.
towards God's love.
I was thinking about, I think it was last week, you were talking about that you were just kind of in a funk, a difficult place. And, just you, at your spouse's suggestion, you moved your location, and you were listening to birds on your back porch. And that idea struck me a couple of times this week because it's been a beautiful week, and the idea of just being in nature and like taking Max for long walks in my neighborhood where there's a lot of mature trees and things. I just it there is my day is different if I've not been intentional about doing about spending time about that. And in Dallas, where I lived for 10 years, there's not a lot of what I would call natural beauty in the sense of, through stunning architecture or things like that. So you have to work to find it. But when you do, like those are your places. But you have to work to do it. But here, like you just walk out your door. I mean, again, one of the great opportunities. All right, I will move us along. Thank you so much for that conversation. Chapter 34 is entitled Bear Fruit by Christ Like Descending. And Cain begins the chapter right off by saying, spirituality is all about bearing fruit. And again, a theological scriptural reference from Luke 3, John the Baptist says, even now the axe is lying at the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Like, I want to be a Baptist when I read, no offense, but I just want to be a good Southern Baptist when I read those scriptures.
This is really off point, but I got to tell you, I read an article this morning about the Southern Baptists are thinking about taking Southern out of their name,
Really?
and they don't want to go through the legal change,
Right.
but they want to be known as the Great Commission Baptist
Yeah, that doesn't just roll off the tongue.
because of the implications of
Yeah.
Southern.
Well, I was going to say, I just like
So you won't be able to say that anymore.
this, hellfire and damnation. But King goes on to write that Jesus commanded his followers to share with those who had need, and that generosity was one way of bearing fruit. And I will tell you, I experienced both of you, but not only you, but your families, like your spouses, your children, who I've been really fortunate to get to know, not only through you, but themselves. So, how has generosity changed your lives? And have you always been generous people, or has that been something that you've developed over your lives?
I guess it's something that certainly has developed, like everything about me, it has developed and
Mhm.
changed. But I certainly learned it um, as a child growing up, and um, models of generosity in my home and in the church were certainly abounded. I had not have thought of this till the second, but my mother always said when she made cookies, she made 3 times as much, some to eat, some to freeze, some to give away.
Oh.
And
I love that.
it, it was just always about giving away of oneself as much as one's resources. So um, I can't say that it's not intentional. It is, but it also just became a way of being that was bred into me, if you will.
Yeah, yeah.
I will say, there are a lot of threads there, but I'm also the product of um, depression parents.
That's right. Yeah.
And uh, without going into all the detail, my mother's family was unaffected by the depression, in fact, had servants during the depression. My father lived 6 blocks away, and his father had been a stockbroker. So they were desperately poor in the same town, going to the same church. And that was the juxtaposition, I would say, in that town. So I will say that for my mother, because she always had enough, she taught us about generosity. My father wanted to be generous in his heart, but he was again the product of poverty, and it was a constant growing edge for him. So fast forwarded, and I got a little of both of them,
Hmm.
and I marry my husband, who is one of the most generous human beings I
Yeah.
know.
I mean, I
He
watched David.
he does it
He's just incredible.
quietly. He does it financially. He does it with his, the way he volunteers.
Yeah.
And over the years, he was very committed to tithing from the very moment we met. And that became a part of our lives. And, it's shifted over the years. It's gone to church and community groups and all of that. But we both are pretty much, when it comes to a need we see, we'll both say, why don't you just pray about it and figure out a number and we'll figure it out. And usually we come up with the same number.
Mm.
But I really attribute most of it to him. Generosity is a really important part of our lives, and I hope it is a part of our children's lives um, as they grow.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, you have both. You talked about your mom's cookies, which I just love that approach.
Mhm.
But I've also just experienced generosity in both of your spirits. You've both opened your homes to me in wonderful ways that mean so much to me. You've included me in your family life, and hopefully you feel that as I've included you in mine, and things like that. But so I just feel like the spirit of generosity is just who you are. I mean, obviously, it lives itself out. I mean, the way you can count it, I guess, in some ways, is through financial generosity. But I don't know. Like, I mean, if you said to me, name 5 generous people in your life, I mean, the two of you would be on that list. David would certainly as well. And one of the things I love about Chuck's work is just who he is professionally. Impacts impacts that. But I think for me, like you all say, my parents set the foundation, but I knew that my own spiritual journey had matured to a different level when I looked at money differently.
Mhm.
And I will say, quite honestly, that has only happened I would say, in the last several years. Um,
It takes time.
it does, and I would say it's still an evolving
Absolutely.
mindset. But I just knew that I was in a new place personally, professionally, spiritually, and financially, but that I just looked at money, abundance differently. And yes, I'm making more money than I ever have. I'm well compensated thanks to the generosity of this church. But it was also, I just looked at money differently, about my responsibility with it. But also, like I was just saying, the generosity of time, the generosity of spirit. And I know that also, like we've talked about before, if that is, if I feel that spirit of generosity shrinking, if you will, I also know that I recognize that as a sign of fatigue, or that things aren't quite where they need to be for me spiritually.
I'm going to add to it. When I wonder how much is enough,
Mm,
that's a really important question for me to ask on a regular basis. And I talk with my kids about it all the
yeah.
time. How much is enough, guys? How
Hmm.
much is enough? We are privileged. And so part of privilege is giving back and asking yourselves, how much do you need? And how much can you give away? And we have those conversations on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think those are really important conversations for parents. I think grandparents have a unique opportunity to have those conversations, because I think that can be, in some way, this is just me thinking out loud, but I think when grandparents have those conversations, it can be less threatening um, than when parents do.
Yeah.
And I say that because, frankly, I, I, I was I was never as close to my grandparents as I'd hoped I could be or would be. But I could envision a place where I could have had those kinds of conversations. Maybe not quite the
It's
ages
A 4-year-old?
of either of your
those
grandchildren.
children.
But, although, I mean, you have a soon-to-be 9-year-old. I mean,
Yes,
I'm just
and
thinking
she
about,
has just reached the point of, well, somebody else has it, why don't I? So I
yes,
don't think she's ready to be.
yes, kind of like my niece who recently, my parents were taking them somewhere and she wanted something that my parents were not willing to buy her. And she said, well, my daddy has money. And it was like, oh, time for these conversations to
Yep, it
start.
is.
But I want to go
Yeah.
back when you mentioned generosity of spirit, because I don't want to be describing myself, but when I experience that in someone else, it's an openness, it's an acceptance, it's a lack of meeting me critically that I feel at home and welcomed by this other person. And so that's what I would want to be. And that's love is generosity, I guess. I mean, in terms of acceptance and openness to other people.
Yeah.
And that's important for me to have in my life and to try to live up to.
Yeah. No, I do. I think it's so easy, especially in the culture we live in, that generosity is often a financial discussion, which it is. That's certainly a significant part of it. But I think it is about the generosity of spirit that we experience and that we exude. I'm doing a time check. Oh, all right. I'm going to move us along. All right. I'm going to jump ahead to chapter 35 that says, be faithful by putting self-interest aside. And on page 121, King writes, patience is what we need till the seed begins to sprout. I think I highlighted that because it hit home for me. And then again on 121, lower on the page, he writes, notice how Jesus tried to conceal his own identity. He wasn't born in an elegant home or to a family of influence. Yes, he had a respectable lineage, but Mary was just a simple woman of her time. Nobody expected much from her, but God hid God's life in her. So I'm just going to be real honest. He hit a lot of buttons with me in that statement. The Gospel of Matthew begins, I can't remember, I meant to look it up. I think it's like the first 25 verses of the first chapter is tracing Jesus's lineage to King David. So, certainly not being a biblical scholar, but I would say that Jesus had more than a respectable lineage, because the writer of Matthew is all about connecting Jesus to King David, because that was a really important, particularly understanding for the Jewish people who wanted a Messiah in their midst. And so I was like, okay, I don't think I would go there. And then this idea that no one expected much from Mary is that so let's be honest, Mary's one of the few women in Scripture that we know by name, because there was such little regard for the place of women at the table of Christianity or church in society, that women are not even named so often. And so I just feel like one of the great challenges that we have in the future of the church is continuing to combat the secondary role that we've put women into. For instance, I was listening again to a podcast over the weekend about the fact that there were no female speakers at the March on Washington, and that was a significant debate within the leadership of the civil rights movement, that obviously powerful speakers that to this day we still remember, but Fannie Lou Hamer and others who had done so much work but not lifted up at the March on Washington. Not my place as a white male to critique that, but raising up that point. And so I just feel like, what does the future of the church look like if we don't call these situations out and not continue when authors say things like, no one expected much from her? So obviously, you're women in ministry. We've talked about the fact you've been basically the first in each of your roles.
Okay, let me just say that nobody expected anything from women in that day, and the fact that Mary was lifted up was a step forward,
Hmm.
and that Jesus lifted up women was a step forward.
Yeah.
What I think he's trying to do, as he has continued to do, is about how important a servant heart is
Hmm.
in being able to be used by God. And so the way I was able to sort of convoluted get to the place of understanding where he's coming from is recognizing that Mary was willing to be an unknown, hidden figure and still fulfill God's role. So I'm okay with that. Here's where the challenge comes for me as a woman in ministry. I can choose to be servant hearted and I can choose to be hidden. But when people want to hide me, that's a different story.
Mm.
It's about choice. And I feel really privileged that I've been able to have a voice in the United Church of Christ, since the beginning of my ministry, and it's gotten easier over the years. So now I get to choose if I want to be in the front or I can choose to be hidden. But for me, that's really the issue, is choice.
That makes so much sense, and I just think about the Magnificat, about how that's such an image of a powerful woman,
Yeah,
and
and
Mary's language there. But I think it's also been lifted up in modern times. I don't know that it would have been perceived that way.
no, it wouldn't. And I think in light of that, I get where he's coming from. I wouldn't use that language, but I kind of understand what he's talking about.
And I agree with everything you said. I went to a different place with this whole section. Yes, we've expected little to nothing of women, and that's changed a lot. But in this section, I really wanted to like what he said in my own way. So
Both and.
both it. So the notion of little was expected. That, for me, is the truth of Jesus' ministry throughout.
Yes.
Little was expected of the Samaritans. Little was expected of Bethlehem, and little was expected of tax collectors and sinners and publicans and prostitutes and unknown women. So that for me, part of the good news of the gospel is that God lifts up those people and in Jesus' ministry and says, I love these people.
Mm.
And so in that sense, it doesn't become about women versus men. It's about who do we think matters? Who do we expect something good to come from? And so my modern day analogy that this sort of got my head spinning was people would expect, and this is not a negative thing, this is a fact and a good fact, people would expect good things to come from Naples United Church of Christ, where we've got wonderful people with a wonderful spirit, wonderful generous spirit, and wonderful ideas and hard workers. But where in our society are the people now for whom we don't expect much to come from them?
Mm-hmm.
And so just because it was an easy identifiable place, not because it's in any way the only possibility, I thought to myself, well, I can imagine people saying they don't expect much to come out of Immokalee.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm going to look at Immokalee through the eyes of the gospel, instead of saying, what can I do for them? I need to be saying, what can they do for me? What did they have to teach me? Because the gospel says God loves them and God can use them to help me descend.
Right.
His talk in terms of
Right.
descending. But it did a lot. I found myself doing a lot of spinning about this, but it was really not about women. It was about lifting up the lowly, and as he says, becoming the lowly. I mean, this notion of self-descending and descending into the ground. So, like I said, I went a really different place, but I had fun spinning
That's
my
great.
thoughts.
Well, I was going to say that's so powerful because, one thing that he did talk about that did resonate wholeheartedly with me is he does talk about that Bethlehem was an unexpected place, which, we lift up, or I attempt to lift up in the pulpit or during worship or especially Christmas Eve every year, because Bethlehem is and was such an unexpected place. And so I just love that image, Sharon. So thank you of Immokalee. And in some reading that I do and have done, and I think you as well, all of you as well, both of you as well, is talking about a new way of looking at mission and outreach is to ask those questions, not kind of the descending or condescending,
Hmm.
but that true transformational mission outreach and mission work is about how can we partner together, what can we learn from one another, not I'm here to save the day,
Right.
and I think that's
Absolutely.
really, really important. I want to jump ahead to chapter 36 that says we shatter ourselves to bear fruit. And Deb, you alluded to this earlier. The chapter begins this way: the spirituality of Jesus reaches its peak on the cross. And King is promoting in this chapter, in my opinion, a view of the crucifixion of Jesus that would be known in theological circles as substitutionary atonement. The idea that Jesus was sent to earth and had to die for our sins and took his place on the cross. And that was an idea, an understanding of Good Friday that I would say, mostly comfortable with, familiar with growing up. But during seminary, and really, I would say shortly after reading authors and theologians like Marcus Borg, Walter Brueggemann, Barbara Brown Taylor, Diana Butler Bass, but really John Shelby Spong, who's been here twice as a distinguished speaker, and then had been in my church in Dallas, I realized that this was really didn't fit my understanding, particularly of a loving God. And Spong writes this: what human life needs is not a theology of human denigration. That is what atonement theology gives us. What we need is a theology of human fulfillment. And that comes from his book, Biblical Literalism, A Gentile Heresy, Journey into a New Christianity Through the Doorway of Matthew's Gospel. And so we are here in Lent. If I'm doing the math right, it's the fourth week of Lent. So we're really on the cusp of the Holy Week journey leading into Easter. And I'm just thinking about atonement and thinking about the place of the cross and, light things like that. I'm curious what thoughts we might share about some of those ideas.
Well, it has always been a problematic theological assertion for me. I have never understood substitutionary atonement, even though I grew up with it.
Right.
I just didn't get it. If God is loving, why would God require a sacrifice to please God's self? I've never really understood it. And so, even in seminary, I did a paper on it. I really struggled with it. And for me, it wasn't until I started looking at Franciscan
Mm-hmm.
spirituality and theology, in particular John Duns Scotus, as interpreted through Richard Rohr, that I started getting it. And he's talked about atonement initially is really a way of bringing us to at one-ment with God, which is a good start, but that's not really what turned me. There's a quote that I want to share. It said, Jesus did not come to change the mind of God about humanity. Jesus came to change the mind of humanity about God.
Yeah.
And that for me is the heart of it, is that Jesus dying on the cross was not something done to correct theology. It was just a fulfillment of God's love, in the sense that we saw God willing to give God's self up to show us how much we were loved.
Mhm.
That's, for me, the only way I can understand atonement.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was Spong, but I heard a term, cosmic child abuse. This idea that God was going to send God's only child to die. And I have to tell you, like, that was so convicting for me. Like, I just all of a sudden went, oh yeah, like that's not my God. And if it is, I have a I have a lot of student debt and reassessment to figure out, because
Yeah.
I
But-
can't keep doing this.
But you know what else I didn't say that helpful is that, remember, the Gospels were written in a culture where there was still sacrifice at the temple.
Right. I mean,
So they were writing to an audience that understood God in that way, and it was. And I think even though substitutionary atonement is what kind of came out how the church's theology emerged, maybe in fact what those writers were trying to tell us is it's not going to be that way anymore.
Right.
That's what. It's just not.
and it doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be. Jesus shows us it doesn't. That's not what God is requiring of us.
Right. And, I mean, if nothing else, Jesus teaches us constantly that Jesus came to show a new way. And, people, whenever you read Scripture, you always have to understand, or attempt to understand, the context, I believe, the context in which it was written. I mean, when we talk about progressive theology and progressive ideas, that's one of the foundational ideas, is that we take the historical critical context, meaning we put ourselves as best we can into that story or into that time and era, which, again, a Jewish time and place would say that sacrificial atonement, a sacrifice had to be made. Those were temple laws.
And not just the Jewish culture at that point in time.
Touche. Sorry, that was not well.
No, it
well
was just
worded,
it was a culture.
but it was a culture of sacrifice.
Yeah.
The reason we have scapegoats, that word comes from goats carried the sins of people. They literally, in temple practice, would put their sins on the goat and send the goat into the wilderness. That's how we have scapegoats. I mean, it was literally something that happened.
Yeah. I would agree with all that has been said, and just add a couple things. We probably all learned the notion of atonement in terms of at-one-ment, but that is so important to me, because it really is, for me, that equals, if you were to do the equation, reconciliation. How is it that humanity is reconciled to God? And so...
And I just want to pause for a second to say, I think that's like a really important bridge between the two conversations, is to say that the reconciliation piece, because the thinking of the time being that the way reconciliation was achieved was through that sacrifice. And
Right.
so it's all about how do we become reconciled with God.
Right. And for me, it wasn't that God sent Jesus to die, but the other part of it, I mean, it shows God's love. It also shows human sin, in terms of, in the face of such love, people still didn't get it, still allowed this to happen, and said, no, take him. Even when offered, the opportunity to crucify somebody else. But so it shows the depth of God's love, the reality of human sin. But then the story doesn't end there. And so the Easter message for me is that very same love that God has is greater even than any human sin, greater than death, and is what can overcome and defeat all those things. And so that's all of a piece for me in terms of how humanity gets reconciled to God. But then I understand the whole Bible as about God coming to people, trying to get people to enter into a covenant relationship and live the way that God intends to live for that joyful, abundant life. And we keep messing it up. But God never stops.
Right. And, grace upon grace, we get to, it's the Benedictines that say every day we begin again. And I love that as almost as a rule of life. It is their rule of life, but as a personal rule of life, that every day, and sometimes, let's be honest, or I'll use an I statement, every moment or every hour, we can begin again. And that's the promise of the grace of God. Irenaeus, an early church scholar, early church parent, talks about it's the idea of Christus Victus, the idea of Christ the victor. Um, and that's always been, as far as like early church theology, that's always been something that I've been more comfortable with. Again, not this idea that Jesus had to go to the cross or had to die, but the idea that through Christ and through resurrection, we understand that God ultimately won and wins over all the things that earth gives us, including death and ultimately death.
Mhm.
It is that reminder to me as a Christian pastor and as a Christian person of faith that there is absolutely nothing that can happen on this side of life that God cannot ultimately win. And there are just some days I need that reminder. And so when I think about when I think about some of those early ideas about atonement, this idea that Christ ultimately wins, that God ultimately wins through Christ, has always been a helpful thought to me. Um, the last chapter, chapter 37, says we are fruitful through close friendship with God. John 15:5 says, probably one of the best known, I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. And then on page 125, King writes, only when we become close friends with Jesus can we produce abundant spiritual fruit. What does it look like in your life to be close friends with Jesus?
Well, I was reminded of, the hymns that you learn as a child.
Yeah.
Part of why a traditional church for progressive people fits me is I grew up in a traditional church, and those, um, it's more than ritual, but that the life of the church is deeply in my soul, and that includes the hymns that you remember, and so we still get to sing, um, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." And for me, it's about embracing the full humanity of Christ, and that, or I should say, the full humanity of Jesus, that he really was a human being who experienced an earthly life as we do, and that makes him accessible in a way that the omnipotent, all powerful, all everything God may not be so accessible. And to think of, I'm not into mediation, but that Jesus as fully human and fully divine um, is more accessible. I don't know how else to say it right
Yeah.
now.
I was really challenged by one of my professors. You've all seen red letter Bibles, right?
Mhm.
Red letter Bibles, for those of you who don't know, are those Bibles that have the words of Jesus in red. And he said, I'd much rather have a green letter Bible, all the things Jesus did.
Oh, wow.
And I've really thought a lot about that, because it's a combination of those two things for me, is rereading over and over. And my particular um, favorite paraphrase right now is the Message, and has been
Yeah.
for several years. Because I grew up in the church, I heard everything from the NRSV and or it was RSV in those days. I heard all of that, and it became sort of almost like I was almost immune to it, and so I needed to try a new translation. And so for me to be a friend with Jesus is to just imagine sometimes being walking along as a disciple, and paying attention to his words and actions, and trying them on for size. Like, what would that look like in my day? What would it look like to watch out for least of these? What would it be like to get away in the wilderness and pray? Would that be like? And trying to replicate it in some ways, not so much, I don't do what would Jesus do, but I kind of look at ways I can put on Christ.
Mm.
And that's what friendship for me is
Yeah.
like.
That's a powerful image. Well, our time has drawn to a close, and I
Well, what does Jesus the friend
yeah.
look
So
like to you?
friendship with Jesus for me, I resonate a lot with what Deb was saying of trying on the practices of Christ, and knowing that sometimes I'm better at it than others, and giving myself that grace. But to take a practice or to read about practice. For some reason, this Lenten season, I've really been struck by the number of times that Jesus goes off by himself to pray,
Me too.
and so so I just keep thinking about, and I don't just think about it. I've been really intentional about what does that look like in my life, and what does that mean for me, and so especially as we come out of the pandemic, and my practices, my living is changing for me in good ways because we're finally get to be around people a little more, and so just kind of looking at those. But what you said, Deb, really resonated with me as well. And so I want to thank you both for the robust discussion, and I want to invite our viewers and church members and friends back next Wednesday evening. Obviously, next Wednesday for our Lenten meditation, and next evening, Wednesday evening, for the next Clergy Roundtable. As we close, I was looking for a prayer, a blessing that was Lenten specific. And I found this from Xavier University, the Center for Mission and Identity, which is a Jesuit resource. And it's called The Fast Life, and it's specific to Lent. And I want to share this as a closing prayer and a closing thought. Fast from judging others, feast on Christ dwelling in them. Fast from fear of illness, feast on the healing power of God. Fast from words that pollute, feast on speech that purifies. Fast from discontent, feast on gratitude. Fast from anger, feast on patience. Fast from pessimism, feast on hope. Fast from negatives, feast on encouragement. Fast from bitterness, feast on forgiveness. Fast from self-concern, feast on compassion. Fast from suspicion, feast on truth. Fast from gossip, feast on purposeful silence. Fast from problems that overwhelm, feast on prayer that sustains. Fast from anxiety, feast on faith. Good night, and thank you for being with us.